Welcome back to episode 6 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Just going to be me and Josh again this week, hopping on the mics to do another Q&A episode. We got a couple questions lined up to answer for you guys, so hopefully we can knock some stuff out here, provide some solid information, and then give Josh and I a chance to nerd out a little bit. So Josh, you want to go ahead and ramble off the first question here?
Yeah, so the first question we have just asks us to discuss what the best way to warm up to a top set is, and if there are any differences that we should consider between training phases.
Yeah, I wanted to include this one. I talked to a client about this morning, so it's just kind of fresh on my mind. I think the main thing I just wanted to say here is that I think it's pretty easy in today's age to, you see a lot of Instagram posts and stuff that talk about making sure that you warm up specific and all that good stuff. And I think on the whole, that's obviously good information. But I do think it's really easy to ignore the fact that, it might be decently common that people aren't actually warmed up when they get to a top set. I know when I don't take it super seriously, I don't have a sweat going, that kind of thing. I think just the general tenets of a good warm up, like getting your core body temperature elevated, I think is something that's pretty easily to ignore. Like just doing a set of 5 with the barbell usually is not enough for me. That's not to say it's not enough for everybody, but I do think that taking that a little bit more seriously and getting the blood going maybe a little bit more vigorously than general is probably a good idea. But then the second thing that came to mind for me is just the psychological approach and kind of deciding what the intent of what you're trying to do is. And, we've talked about this at length as far as kind of periodizing your arousal for a top set. So in a hypertrophy phase, it's not to say that you're not focused. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is you're going in with the intent that this is just going to be really solid practice. I'm not going to overexert myself in the sense of, maybe doing the little things that are going to extend rest periods, getting, your music turned up super loud that may negatively affect the volume work to come after that. So I think that's something to just keep in mind while you're warming up to make sure you're on task, you're staying focused, and you're trying to accomplish the goal that you have at hand. And then obviously if you move into a strength phase, maybe you kind of change those things a little bit, rest a little bit longer, turn up your music a little bit louder, and really try to maximize peak intensity. But as far as the actual warm-up strategy, I think everybody's going to have kind of an accustomed way that they warm up. And I think that's totally fine. Usually my just general broad recommendations are get to 80 or 85% of whatever you're trying to do for the day, and then start taking somewhere between 5 to 7.5% jumps from there. That's generally just a broad recommendation of what I like to do. Recording your RP, your velocity on the way up, and trying to hit your target for the day if you're using some sort of auto-regulated prescription. But other than that, I don't have too much specific advice, but I think the general warm-up kind of thing was the main thing that was on my mind. Usually I just do like to do some general dynamic warm-up stuff just a little bit to try to get the blood going a little bit before I hit the bar. But you could also do just sets of 5 with the bar every 30 seconds or something like that to get a sweat going. Sounds miserable, but it works if you do it for 5 minutes. And I think that just taking a little bit extra time to get a sweat going is probably a good idea. You got anything to add there, Jay?
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing I want to echo there is to not neglect just what the benefits of a general warm-up. And I've kind of caught myself failing to do so because I've noticed at times that my velocity will actually increase set to set with submaximal loads, which probably indicates that I'm literally warming myself up during the working sets, which is not the goal. And that means that my force production during my first or second working set is lower than it should be, and thus the training stimulus is going to be less effective. So you can kind of check yourself if you do have access to a velocity tracker, or just remind yourself that you should probably feel pretty warmed up going into your top sets and your first working sets. And I think how you get your core body temperature elevated is kind of arbitrary, right? If you want to make it specific, that's awesome, and that might have some other benefits. But if you want to do some non-specific things, I don't think that's necessarily a downside. So finding some happy medium in what works for you is probably your best bet. And that kind of leads me to my next point, is to keep things rather consistent. So when you're warming up to a top set, Zach and I like to take the exact same warm-up jumps, especially once you get, to 70% of your 1 rep max or above, because we like to track the velocity of those repetitions and use that as another way to gauge progress. You don't have to be that precise with it, but I think having a general framework of how you're warming up and keeping it consistent is important, because I think a lot of us forget that warm ups are training volume. So if you're drastically changing your warm up protocol, working up to a top set week to week, that's going to influence your training volume. Now, do we have to be that uber precise about tracking training volume? No, but I think we should keep it generally consistent week to week. If you're doing, 10-pound jumps one week and then 20-pound jump or 30-pound jumps the next week, that might influence things. So, but that's not to say you can't take extra warm-ups if you need them. I would just take those extra warm-ups with the barbell, with 135, that sort of thing. So like for myself, if I'm like, okay, today I'm going to need a little bit extra warm up for whatever reason, I'll do more sets with the barbell as opposed to doing, more sets with 75% of my one rep max, because again, that is training volume. And then the last thing I want to echo that Zach said is controlling kind of like your arousal levels is a big thing, and that is probably the most important thing in terms of the differences between training phases. So for myself, in my current training cycle, I'm breaking the training cycle into 3 blocks. So 2 hypertrophy blocks followed by 1 strength block. And in the first hypertrophy block, my goal was to really just focus on maintaining top end strength and just remaining somewhat comfortable. And I was using velocity to keep myself honest and keep those top sets really below RP6, which was kind of frustrating at times because I wanted to go up, but the velocity wasn't letting me go up. But another thing I did is I really just kind of removed the arousal or the hype from the top sets and just kind of like didn't allow myself to turn my music up before approaching the bar, which I think really allowed me to focus on the rest of the training session where we think you're really making your money during a hypertrophy focused phase. So during the back off sets for the main lift, as well as, moving on to more hypertrophy friendly exercises, that really gave me a lot more energy. And I noticed that I didn't really have a come down after a top set. So I didn't really have that psychological fatigue carrying over to the rest of the session. So I think that's an important variable that's often overlooked. And also going back to the consistency thing is keeping that arousal consistent week to week as well, right? So, again, it's not to say it's going to be perfectly the same, but if you have a different training environment week to week or whatever, or you just are extremely variable in how you approach the barbell, that's really going to cloud things. So those are my general ramblings. If Zach, you want to throw the next question out, unless you have anything to add.
Oh, that was good. Let's go to the next one. So we got this question on Instagram. Josh, how would you set up a program to determine if a certain individual responds better to strength or hypertrophy biased training?
So this is a really good question. It's kind of a broad question, so I hope that we answer what this guy was intending to ask. So when I first saw this question, my initial thought is, oh, perfect. The way we design training cycles kind of inherently does that, because we have this hypertrophy focused phase followed by a strength focused phase. And what you can do is look at the trends in estimated 1RM during the 2 phases and see if the rate of gain is greater in one or the other. However, the caveat there is the way we set things up is that you might be kind of setting the stage during a hypertrophy phase, but those top end strength gains aren't realized until the strength phase, or until you potentially taper volume a little bit at the end of the training cycle. So what you have to do then is to retest and remove those confounding variables the next time you test to see if your hypothesis is correct. So let's say I'm coaching Zach and we notice a really good jump in top end strength during a strength phase, but we ran a hypertrophy phase before it, and we saw just kind of a moderate rate of gain. What we can do is we can bias the next training cycle to more quote unquote strength style training and see if we still get that consistent response, or we may notice that doesn't occur, and thus we can probably bet that the hypertrophy phase is what set the stage, and thus we need both of them. It's not just the immediate term that's leading to those 1RM strength gains. So I'll kind of stop there, and Zach, you can add what you think I missed.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to set kind of the conversation here. I think I always just like philosophically have a hard time when people say like, what does somebody respond to? Just because, from a physiological perspective, we've talked about this at length many times. It just doesn't sit well with me that somebody would like inherently respond differently to like just slightly different styles of training. Now, granted, on the far ends of the spectrum, there probably is some degree of individual response there, but I think it's just important to realize that I just have a hard time believing that you would respond just infinitely better to one simple like kind of change in training variables and not respond at all to some different change in training variables. I just think it's important to take a step back and realize how many things go into this picture. And that's where we bring in all the outside stuff that I think is really easy to say, but really take a second to realize how much that really does influence the picture as far as life stress, sleep, nutrition, all these other factors that are layered onto this picture of simply observing a simple training variable like estimated 1RM. Now, again, I want to reiterate, it's not to say individual responses to training in a stronger rate of gain, like Josh said, to one style of training doesn't exist. I think it does, but I think we do need to kind of hedge the conversation a little bit to realize that these observations are really, really noisy, and there's a lot of inputs that go into that system. So drawing a strong conclusion to say I respond to this inherently better than something else, I think requires some pretty strong evidence. So again, that's not to say it doesn't exist and it can't happen, because I have seen that pretty happen a few times in my own coaching experience. Like Josh, we've talked a few times now. One of my clients, Patty, is doing some very, very high volume and high RP training and has a very, very positive response with their estimated 1RMs right now. Obviously, if you follow our stuff, that's generally not the phase I'm expecting to see that. And we do. So I'm definitely going to explore that more, abandon my own bias, and realize that the emerging data in front of me is very, very important, and take that into consideration. And I really like the way that Josh painted the picture of saying, we probably have these kind of these sequential phases that we think make sense in theory, and I'm going to put some stock in that. But what we can do is use the emerging data and what seems to be an individual response to maybe one style of training or the other, and just kind of bias the entire cycle in that direction. Because what I think, like Josh said, that allows us to kind of explore to see if that style of training is inherently better, or if it was some type of higher order effect on the combination of the blocks themselves. So I think that's a really, really good approach to take things, and that's generally how I would do it as well. I think another example you could try is let's say Josh had that same client where we had a hypertrophy block, then a strength block, and the strength block seemed to go really, really well. Another way you could try that is when the cycle is over, you could just do another strength block again. And this time it isn't potentiated from the hypertrophy block, and see if the strength block elicits a similar rate of gain as the one you just completed. If not, it's probably logical to assume that hypertrophy block had some degree of potentiation in the strength block. Again, with the caveat that there is a ton of inner working factors that go into that observation. Let's say in that previous strength block, maybe you were sleeping really well, nutrition was on point, but in the next one, you got a new job and you were really, really stressed. That is just an example of how these observations can get a little bit muddied, but I do think that's another really practical example to kind of test that and see if there is any higher order effect that is kind of navigating that individual response. So go ahead, Josh. I was rambling for a while there. Anything else?
Yeah, I just want to kind of maybe piggyback off of a couple things you said there. You gave the example of Patty's training, and how you're kind of straying from what our biases are. And that's something I've been thinking about recently. And when we make, when we put information out there, that's something that I kind of struggle with at times, is because when you're putting information out there, you're talking about averages, and you're talking about what makes sense on paper, and just a high level theoretical training philosophy. But then when I actually think about individual client training protocols, I often stray from it a good amount, right? And Patty was an example you gave. So it's hard to make content about that process, but maybe that's something we should start working on, because it is, again, it's just a starting point, because we have these biases, and if we get a new client, we're going to take in information that they provide to us, but and we're probably going to put them on something that is quote unquote what we think will work best on paper, but the information you're gathering on that individual should absolutely override any biases you have. So that's just something I wanted to add, is that when you consume our stuff, to kind of keep that in mind, that this is a starting point, and that goes for everything, right? Research is reported on the averages. So if you have a reason to stray from it, you should stray from it, because I'm more confident, even though we never have a control group with an individual's training, I'm more confident in looking and following that over time, right? And then you can use these tests and retests that we've been talking about, and that's what the individualization process is. It's just a bunch of testing and retesting over and over again until you slowly find what seems to work. And the caveat there is that changes over time. So we're kind of chasing our tail. And that's what makes this so fun. And Zach, I'm sure you would agree that the longer we work with a client, the easier it is to kind of customize training, because you have all this other information, all this other context that you guys have accumulated together. And maybe the first cycle you run together, you see fireworks at the end and a bunch of PRs. Maybe not, but it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, when you kind of land on their formula. So again, it's kind of, I just wanted to emphasize that difference between what we think is best on paper and how that's often strayed from in real life. So
I just to piggyback on that for a second, I almost think it's, as far as like a mental model and philosophy of like how we come to what we think is the quote unquote most optimal training for somebody, I almost think it's more important that your system allows you to stray from it more so than assembling a system that you think is going to put somebody in a perfect alley right away, if that makes sense. That may seem like kind of obvious when you say it, but I think having a system you're familiar with and tools within that system that allow you to see deviation, I think is really, really important. So like, we've talked about a few of the tools that we use. One of the tools that really helped me kind of pick out Patty as an outlier in this regard is somebody, okay, maybe what we think on paper is quote unquote perfect. Isn't gonna be the recipe here. Like on those AMRAP tests, Josh, that we talk about a lot as using as a way to kind of individualize the repetitions performed at a given percentage. She was getting like plus 10 reps at like a 7 RP with 80% of 1 round. That generally is kind of astronomically high. So immediately I was realizing, I was like, man, this is atypical. And so that just allowed me to have that expectation violation and then start exploring other ways in which I'm probably, I just need to abandon my bias and go with the data that's emerging in front of me. I think, like you said, Josh, just acknowledging the fact that is completely natural and that almost to some degree needs to happen. And if you're not, then maybe you're just accepting your biases blindly and not actually looking for the information to, reject it. So I think that's just important to consider. And it's something we're always trying to struggle with. Like Josh said, like we know these things, yet we try to communicate information about what is best practices. What do we think is the best starting point? And it's difficult because we know while that is, what we're going to do from a starting point, the coaching process really begins after you've written the first program. The assembly of the first training cycle is only just the beginning. And really the work from there is taking that and the emerging information and then deciding what to do next. Because anybody can write a really solid program and, hopefully get some pretty good results, especially if you're working with a new coach and you factor in all the psychological things that go along with that. You're really hyped up with training, positive expectations, all that good stuff. But making those adjustments and figuring out, okay, here's my preconceived notions of how this is supposed to work. It didn't work how I expected it to. Now where do we go from here? And I think that's the most difficult, but also, like you said, Josh, that's what makes coaching fun. It's a problem-solving endeavor that we get to, dig into it and try to prove ourselves wrong and just see where to go from here with the many different cases we kind of come across. So yeah, I'm just rambling now and sound like an old man, but it's fun and frustrating all at the same time, and that's kind of what makes it cool.
Yeah. So one thing I just want to clarify, um, even though there's this individualization or this customization process, I think something that I know I've learned the hard way, is there's definitely a difference between prioritizing individualization and like overemphasizing it. So kind of where my head is with this is that if you have a solid plan set, you need to see the training cycle through. That's not to say that block to block you might make minor adjustments, but I think a lot of us fall in the trap of major week to week adjustments. But then what that does is it just almost eliminates all the signal to noise that you have. And that's something we discussed on our last podcast with Mike T, is this concept of signal to noise. And honestly, with my coaching practice, that's something I'm trying to prioritize a bit more, is maximizing that signal to noise ratio as much as possible. And if you're making these week to week changes, that really clouds the picture. And when I say week to week changes, I don't mean changing your top set from a triple at 8 to a double at 8. I mean changing frequency, training volume. Really, kind of the rule of thumb that I go by, and I know you do as well, Zach, is if the individual is bought into the training process, if they're enjoying it for the most part, and if there aren't any aches or pains that are worrisome, then you see the training through, because a lot of times it might take some time for the adaptations to develop, having realistic expectations as to rate of gain. And also, if you do finish a training cycle or a training block or whatever the unit of training you're using is, and you've changed all these things and the individual didn't progress, then not only did they not progress, but now you have no solid information going forward. So, it like plateaus happen, but if you're going to plateau, at least have some information going forward. Because if you're not progressing, you're at least learning, is a way to kind of reframe that. So it's just something I wanted to emphasize, because I didn't want anybody to kind of, misunderstand what we're trying to say there.
Yeah, I think kind of one other thing we wrote down here just kind of naturally goes into that. Like we were talking about this a little bit off air, and I totally identify with that. There's a fine balance between trusting your intuition, but also systematizing things, I think. And I think a lot of times, I definitely have an idea and a system within my head, but I do think there's value in writing it down very, very explicitly and having these things really, really well laid out, not only as a coach, but maybe also for the client to examine, to demonstrate the process in which you're trying to, like you said, Josh, maximize the signal to noise ratio. And one thing we've kind of discussed is adding another tab to our spreadsheet to kind of really, really flesh this out, to say, potentially we could really spell out the unit in which we're trying to repeat, or we're making changes at that rate, whether that be the cycle, block, that kind of thing. And then, as we go along and as we go through that cycle, making notes so that when we come back to the point where we're about to repeat a new unit, then we can make those changes and kind of test and retest more efficiently, as you said, Josh, and really try to make it as much, there's always going to be limitations, to make it as much of like the scientific method as possible. So, these aren't new ideas. Obviously, Mike went on about this at length in the last podcast. Like, this is really what emergent strategy is all about, but we're just trying to, use our background and our experience to kind of put our own spin on it and develop what we think is going to be the most efficient ways to combine our ideas and our experience to kind of get at some of the same things, to maximize a signal to noise ratio and really flesh those things out in a way that systematizes it a bit better. So I think that's something I definitely plan to explore a little bit more. I think you do as well, Josh. But yeah, I think we covered that one pretty good, man. You want to go on to the next one?
Yep. So next question is, what do you think about pushing exercises such as skull crushers or leg extensions, so kind of these single joint accessory work, in the 3 to 5 rep range, and how might that transfer to the big 3?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it really comes down to like, what are you trying to accomplish? Because to me, single joint movements, kind of generally the reason, excuse me, you're going to include them in a strength program is to, be able to accumulate more volume with less of a fatigue tax associated with it. So if that's the case, generally they're going to be more so dedicated towards hypertrophy. And so if that's the case, we know that hypertrophy is kind of ubiquitous regardless of the rec range that you're training in. And I don't necessarily see the reason you would want to do that. It's not to say you can't. I think you could, but I do think if you're kind of going to take the logic behind why you use these exercises all the way to its end, you would probably want to use the rep range that also does that. And I think doing sets of like heavy sets of 3 on skull crushers, just, caveats about injury risk and all that aside, like that just makes my elbows hurt. So thinking about it. So I don't know if I would do that. So I'd probably train those more so in the typical hypertrophy rep range, 8 to 15 or something like that. The one example I could see doing that is that, Josh, if we're using some of these lower fatigue strategies and you're still including those exercises in a low fatigue block, which we might do. So like leg extensions, for example, let's say in a hypertrophy block, you were doing sets of 10 at like an 8RB, that's about a 12 rep max. Then when we go over to a low fatigue strength phase, we might take that same load and do sets of 5 to 6 with it, which is going to be, it's going to be in that rep range, but really you're just using the same load that's lighter. So it's not really heavy sets of 3 to 5, like I'm thinking based on this question. So there's a way you could train in that rep range, but I guess that's not necessarily what I'm interpreting from this question. So heavy sets of 3 to 5, generally probably not. I think if you're going to, use that rep range, I'd rather use it on the big lifts anyway, as there's probably more of a skill component that, those other lifts, single joint lifts aren't really going to be attacking anyway. So long story short, I would probably use a higher rep range, but you could do that if you'd like. And if it doesn't beat you up, I suppose you could. I don't know if you have anything to add there, man.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit worried because you just noceboed all 11
See, come on, man. Don't do that to me. I tried to put the caveat in there, but
no, I think you overviewed that really well. So like an example of when you may drop the rep range, around 5 reps for exercises like this is exactly what you were saying, Zach, in a low fatigue strength phase. When you're trying to reduce the RPE of these sets, but still, accumulate the necessary training volume, something that you might prescribe is maybe you use a 10 to 12 rep max on, one of these accessories, and you perform, 2 cluster sets of 4 reps, for example. So you use your 10 rep max load, you do 4 reps, maybe you rest 45 seconds, do 4 reps again. And that kind of accomplishes what we want from a low fatigue strength phase, in which we are keeping the average RPE low, we're keeping the load relatively high, and we're still able to accumulate a good amount of training volume. So, even though we're not going to prescribe like a set of 5 at RPE 9 on leg extensions, we may still reduce the rep range on exercises like that. So, that's kind of all I have to say about that. If you want to throw the next one out there, Zach.
Yep. So next question. Where can one learn more about velocity/RPE training and how to periodize it?
So we actually included this question because we're nearing the end of this episode. We'll see how long it actually goes. But we're thinking about, putting something out there, some sort of like formal education product. And we are curious to get your guys' input as to what may be useful and what you may want to see from us. So we figure that individuals that would be interested in that are the type of individuals to make it to the end of this podcast. So if you do have any thoughts or things you want to see, DM one of us on Instagram, get in contact with us and let us know, and hopefully we can find something that's beneficial.
Cool. You want to go one more, Josh?
Sure.
Right.
Should I
Go ahead.
throw out number 6 here on the outline?
Yep.
Cool. So the next question is, do you have any training ideas for getting enough done when time is restricted for a couple of months?
Yeah, so I think this is a really practical question. I think we come, we come at this quite a few times as coaches and also for ourselves, I think, when we get pretty busy. So there's a few strategies I like to use that just come to the top of my head that are generally, some of them are phase specific, but some of them are just in general. The first and foremost thing is set up your training so that supersets are antagonistic supersets specifically are a logistical option for you. So that antagonistic superset would be doing 2 exercises back to back of muscle groups that essentially don't affect one another. So easy example, dumbbell bench in a row. Maybe, you could also do like a dumbbell bench and a leg press, for example, or a high bar squat or something like that. But I think that is the first and foremost thing that I would have somebody do, just because you are able to get essentially 2 sets for core exercises done with a rest period of 1, and just shortens up training time quite a bit. So that's definitely the first thing I would consider. Second thing that comes to mind is using strategies like myo reps or cluster sets, depending on the phase. Myo reps would be essentially taking, somewhere between an 8 to 15 RM load, taking that relatively close to failure, like somewhere between 8 to 9 RP, maybe even to failure if you like, and then just performing mini sets to a given RPE with like a 20-second rest period after that. Theory behind that is you're able to get in quote unquote hard sets with a very, very short amount of rest. So if I was doing maybe time unrestricted, let's just say I'm doing 4 sets of curls, 4 sets of 10 at 8 RP with like standard rest, somewhere between 2 to 3 minutes or something like that. For a myo rep protocol, I could take 1 set of 10 to like that 9 RP or something like that, wait 20 seconds, knock out another set to an 8 to 9 RP, however many repetitions that is, rest another 20 seconds, do the same thing, and then accumulate those same 4 sets in a very, very short amount of time. So that would be probably more of a hypertrophy bias protocol, just because doing that is going to accumulate a ton of intraset fatigue, even more so than standard hypertrophy training. So that's just something to keep in mind. But for like a strength focus phase, I've had clients before do a similar thing, but we're just shortening the rest periods a ton with the goal of minimizing intraset fatigue and just performing cluster sets. So essentially the idea there is the load is low enough that the short rest periods aren't going to accumulate intraset fatigue. So instead of doing the example I just mentioned of taking like 20 seconds rest and training to a 8 to 9 RP, maybe you take 20 and 30 seconds rest and do doubles every 30 seconds. And the RP there is negligible and the velocity loss is essentially 0 because the load is somewhere between, 70 to 80%. That's another strategy to do strength type training when you're in a time crunch. And I've done that before. And then the last thing is just to cut out stuff that you don't consider a huge priority, would be the kind of the last tier option. So that's your calf raises, bicep curls, potentially if you're already doing some type of.
Whoa. You're going to piss off a lot of people, man.
Hey, man. Well, my white tube socks aren't really giving my calves any glory here. So, so that'd be kind of the third thing I'm thinking of. If you're doing a multi-joint exercise that includes that muscle group, potentially consider taking out a single joint lift for it. So if you're already doing rows and lat pull downs, potentially, although none of us are going to like to hear this, maybe taking out bicep curls is a viable option for the time being while you're time restricted. And then hopefully once you get a little bit more time, you're able to include those things. But those are kind of the 3 main things that came to mind, Josh. I don't know if you have any other kind of general thoughts.
No, I thought that was good. Something that I would add is, and this actually applies to both a hypertrophy focus phase as well as a strength focus phase, is that for your strength practice, peak intensity is probably more important than average intensity, right? So what's most important is that you're practicing a low velocity repetition, and that or a handful of repetitions, top set of 1 to 3 maybe, and those repetitions are slow because of the load on the bar, right? So during a strength phase, maybe we want to take the extra time to work up to a top single at an RP 6 to 8, as opposed to really trying to optimize and doing, sets of 5 at 80%. I'd rather have the individual get up above 85%, get that really solid practice, even though the dose of practice is lower. I'd rather have them get that really solid practice, and then we can move on to the more time efficient stuff. And then the next thing I'd add is, you're kind of trimming the fat based on what phase of training you're in. So, the time difference between working up to a singlet RP5 compared to a singlet RP8 might be considerable, but that might be worth it during a strength phase, and it probably isn't worth it during a hypertrophy focused phase. So just trim the fat, keep the goal of the training cycle, right? Don't be grinding through 5 sets of 3 at RP9 during a hypertrophy phase. Just go up, hit a top set of 1 to 3 in the RP5 to 6 range. That'll warm you up. That'll probably, kind of serve as a potentiation for the rest of the work, and then do some time efficient hypertrophy focused work for the prime movers. So, that's probably the biggest thing is peak intensity should be prioritized, and keep the goal of the training cycle, and trim the fat of, and just kind of keep the other adaptations on maintenance, if that makes sense.
Yep, that was a really good way to wrap that up, dude. I think we'll probably call this episode here. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in again. As Josh mentioned, if you made it to the end of this podcast, you probably, at least to some degree, like our stuff, or just like to listen to us and call us stupid. Either way, go ahead and DM Josh or I about that kind of the course ideas you'd like to us to explore, potentially consider expanding upon in a longer form content or course or whatever. Just kind of an idea we're throwing around. So if any of you have ideas on what you'd like to see or ways we could make that helpful to you guys as our audience, that would be excellent to know. But without that, I think this is where we plug the stuff that I still don't know how to say. Go ahead, give us I think it's 5 stars. It might be 6 stars. I don't even know. However many stars you think were appropriate. Hopefully it's the maximum amount. If not, I understand. On iTunes and whatever other podcast platforms you see. Follow us on YouTube and on Instagram to follow our other content there. And we'll see you guys the next time we put out a podcast. I was going to say next week, but it probably won't be then. So thanks for tuning in, guys.
2 weeks.
See you on the next episode. Yep.
Happy New Year, everybody.